Hi, I'm Elizabeth, and this is the Rights of Nature podcast. My guest today is Kai Huschke. Kai is the Northwest and Hawaii organizer for Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, or CELDF. He was centrally involved in the first in the nation Community Bill of Rights, Worker Bill of Rights, and Voter Bill of Rights campaign efforts in Spokane, Washington. He supported the first law in the nation banning aerial pesticide spraying in Oregon, facilitated the second in the nation and first in Hawaii rights of conservation easement, and is the chief advisor to the Oregon Community Rights Network and the effort to constitutionalize local self-government in Oregon. He is also a national lecturer for Democracy School. So welcome, Kai, and thank you so much for your work on the rights of nature and for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate having the time to talk with you today.
Well, you have spent years working on rights of nature here in the Pacific Northwest and in Hawaii. Can you talk a little bit about the various efforts you've been involved in the rights of nature movement?
Yeah, the organization I've been affiliated with for the last 10 or 11 years, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, has really been at the forefront of really putting out I guess you could say a big question in one realm in the sense of Western law, but a very old reality if you start to look at how people in the environment have found a way to be symbiotic with one another. So if we were to delve into that kind of a conversation, looking at how First Peoples have made their presence such that they weren't depleting their resources or defiling it, but maintaining in a way for themselves as well as for nature itself. Unfortunately, our system of law has a very different view of the natural world, sees it as a thing, as property, and largely we've seen the destruction and depletion of the natural world, and de facto our own survivability is in real peril. The work we've been doing is to really fundamentally try to address that through structures of law. Rights of nature is really about the legalization of rights of nature, and the work we've been doing. The first rights of nature law that was put forward actually came out of a small community in Pennsylvania with our assistance. That really got things rolling in the sense of action out of an idea that had been around for a number of decades at that point. You had people like Christopher Stone, a law professor at UCLA, talking about standing for nature on a pretty seminal case back in the days when William L. Douglas was on the bench in the 70s. But no one had really taken that idea and tried to put it into practice. So until Tamaqua Borough in Pennsylvania did so, with our assistance, we really had no example out there of what it could look like if we had a legal structure that recognized nature from a rights perspective and not a property one. And since then, it's been kind of a slow reality around the expansion of that idea. The next most significant success that our organization and in a way myself have been part of was in Ecuador. That country back in 2008 had gone through a constitutional rewrite process, and in that realm had decided that they wanted it to take a different context, a different view, a different standing when it came to nature, and actually secure rights constitutionally for nature. And so they became the first, and still are really the first country through a written constitution to do so. There then were a number of smaller communities in the United States over the years since then that had followed suit. But I would say it's only been in the last 3 or 4 years that this idea has started to take on, I guess, a certain energy that hadn't existed before, in the sense of the possibility of it, the discussion of it, the debate of it. What does it look like? How do we go about actually making it happen? Is it a necessity? And you're starting to see both courts as well as communities, and in some cases nations, starting to say yes, it is a necessity to to reorient ourselves, or I should say reorient ourselves if you start to look at it again from how people used to relate to ecology. And so our work has really been in the mix with that, with the most significant event of sorts in that rights of nature movement world coming last February in Toledo, Ohio, where the community there had adopted a Lake Erie Bill of Rights to protect that ecosystem that currently is being polluted and destroyed under the directive really of the state. The state is continuing to legalize corporate practices that are actually killing off that ecosystem. And the community in Toledo there basically reached a breaking point, understood that the system was not about protecting it or protecting the people, and really charted a different course for themselves regarding nature and adopting a law that recognized nature's rights. They had no idea that their action would have the kind of ramifications it did on a global scale, but it has, and it continues to reverberate today because of that, and I think has sparked all kinds of interests, all kinds of actions, again, both here in the United States as well as internationally, coming through lawmaking, but also coming through the courts themselves, whether it's recent court decisions in Colombia or ones from a few years ago in India, as well as actions in places like New Zealand. This idea is really feeling like it's gaining momentum, not just as an idea, but the understanding that this is a practical reality that we have to institute if we're going to make it really. Don't mean to sound so dark and gloom, but I think there's in places an awakening going on that really is towards the direction we need to be going. And I think legalization of rights of nature is one of those elements that is significant and needs to continue to grow and set roots as it has started to do in places like Toledo or the Northwest here or elsewhere.
Now, for CELDF, you also teach a course on U.S. history, rights, and democracy called Democracy School. In fact, I first met you at a democracy school course in Bellingham a few years ago, and I really found that course so eye-opening. It rearranged how I thought about American history, as well as my understanding of corporate rights and how we see nature as property and how that's kind of built in to the foundation of the United States as a country. Can you talk a little bit about the main points you teach in Democracy School and how it relates to rights of nature and how people respond to what they learn there?
Yeah, happy to. I think one way to maybe give people some sense of what that school is about for people who have tracked his time when he was with us or have sought out really the broader story of our own existence. In some ways, the Howard Zinn book, People's History of America, is a way to kind of think about what Democracy School is like. It's an attempt to bring in the realities of our system of government, our system of law, sort of the history around that in a way that I believe most of us have not been exposed to. So one approach that we've done in the school is try to pull together as many of the source materials around our conversations about, for instance, the conversation that took place in the formulation of the Constitution itself, the U.S. Constitution. What was talked about, what was the intention, what was the purpose behind that document, in a very revealing way, I think, for a lot of people in comparison to what we're taught in our history classes. And that sort of conversation continues into the realms of things like corporate constitutional rights, this idea that corporations are persons under our system of law and are able to really find greater protection from government than people, nature, and even government itself. Why is that? How did that come to be? How is it used? Also things of which not only the general public is not really exposed to, but even lawyers who go through law school get very minimal exposure to that kind of history and reality of our system. So we try to unpack that all and largely put it in the context of what's really happening now in one's community. And when you're dealing with something of which you find yourself at a severe disadvantage, asking those questions about why that is versus merely accepting that that's the case and dealing within a set of rules that weren't even written by you, and then expecting something to come out to your advantage. It's actually digging deeper to say, well, why are we even in this position? Why weren't we not only considered, but why aren't we the decision makers on these critical matters that are being proposed or are currently underway in our community? And within that context, this discussion about nature itself, how come our system hasn't recognized nature in the way that it needs to be, but actually is done in a large degree the opposite, and has abused it and used it for human gain and largely for corporate gain. We try to talk about that in the school and challenge those that attend to think about that, not only in the context of how it works, but how it could work. And then a big piece of the school is really to talk about, well, what do we do about that? How do we organize? What do we have to pay attention to? How do we subscribe to other successful people's movements? So the frame of which we put the community rights of nature work within is that there's a need for a real people's movement in order to deal with the realities of today, meaning you have to actually look at the structure, not just the surface, but actually go deep into the machine itself. And if you see that it is not built properly and satisfactorily, and you want to change that, well, you have to take the mindset that it's going to take a different type of organizing to get to the point to actually do that course correction. And the school lays out the challenge that what is needed is really a movement of really greater self-determination, a movement to contain corporate overreach, and a movement, as we started off our conversation, to see the natural world differently in the way that we make our rules, and that nature really needs to be seen as a rights-bearing being, and that our behavior as a collective needs to fit within those boundaries and not exceed what nature can actually provide. So it's a pretty ambitious day and a half of time together in the democracy school, but I think it's been done well enough to be both provocative for people and challenging, and also largely a piece that has helped mobilize localized efforts, like had taken place in Bellingham a few years back, and like is taking place there on the San Juan Islands where you live. That the school has served that kind of a function, and so we continue to try to do these schools wherever people would like them taught, as a way again to understand what we're up against, and then ideally to get active, to actually want to do something about changing things for the better.
Yeah, I know for myself, taking the school definitely fired me up to do something, because it was very challenging and made me mad.
Yeah, it has a strange sort of how dare they kind of moments through the school, and I think strangely enough, it can also be cathartic, because it dots maybe that were not connected, I think get connected in the school. And so at least the clarity of what is going on and why it's going on are no longer, I think, as big or maybe a mystery at all. And I think knowing that it's, you can then begin to fathom, well, all right, how do we go about doing something about it? Now more fully understanding what it is we're up against. I suppose it's not so dissimilar to, having a health problem, and if you don't know what you're dealing with, it's hard to figure out what to do to change it, to get healthy again. But once you could really understand what's going on, well, then it becomes much more feasible to figure out a regimen to actually correct for that and become healthy again. And I think the democracy school is sort of laying out that deeper diagnosis, and then suggesting perhaps there is a prescription of what can be done here to make people and communities and nature healthy again.
Hmm. Well, since I took the school and have been studying the various rights of nature cases around the United States and around the world, it is the case that they're taking slightly different approaches depending on where they are in the world, and kind of which basis they're approaching rights of nature from, for instance, in New Zealand, um, the Wanganui River was established as a legal personality related to settling a historical claim of native people to the river. And in that case, they decided to appoint guardians for the river. They have a guardian from the Crown, which I think it represents the New Zealand government, and then one from the Wanganui Iwi people. And then another approach is the one taken by the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, which is to recognize the rights of Lake Erie and state that Lake Erie has standing in a court of law and that any citizen can represent Lake Erie in a court. And then I know here in Washington, there's a group that's proposing that a specific species, the orca, be granted personhood. So and I'm sure there's more too, different kind of variations. Can you talk about these different approaches and kind of the pros and cons, not necessarily the pros and cons, but sort of like why people are approaching rights of nature in certain ways and kind of what the outcome might be for those different approaches?
Yeah, I like how you caught yourself on the pros and cons, because I often can find myself doing the same thing in sort of analyzing and perhaps critiquing what's going on. I think if you back up, which I believe you have done this as well, and really look at the various examples that you've just described, these are all pretty radical shifts in the way that the system of law works today. And so, any one of those that really starts to rattle this really horrible lack of understanding of the world and the sense that we can control and use and abuse nature, to one that reverses that. All those efforts really should be applauded from that standpoint. As we dive deeper, though, there are differences and nuances to what's being attempted here. I think the species idea is in some ways a natural extension, at least in this country, of work that has gone on in the sense of Endangered Species Act, for instance, in this idea of identifying species and identifying the various ecosystems and other natural communities sort of related to the species. And so I think it's a natural place often for people to kind of do their thinking around this idea of rights for species in a true rights sort of constitutional way. So I get that. I also understand the personhood type thinking. If you think about systems of law and how law has recognized ships, for instance, as persons. So, inanimate object like a ship, or even more bizarre, really, that a corporation can be a person. So this thing that has no form, really, it's purely property. It's purely a figment of the imagination of the state in the sense of state corporate codes. And suddenly this thing that doesn't really exist or is tangible or has form is suddenly granted rights that not only equal that of living, breathing human beings, but the collective of that power exceeds that of living, breathing human beings, whether individual or collective. So the legal system has found ways to extend personhood type rights in that manner. So to look at the natural world to say, well, why can't we do that for a river? I also understand. I think that the challenge I put out in regards to probably both of those in the realm that we've been working in is that we kind of need a whole new reality when it comes to law and nature, and one that may be difficult for us to really articulate fully as human beings, for one, but within the context of Western law, for sure, in the sense that nature is something else, and that nature is actually beyond really human existence. Nature will continue, and nature will exist exclusive of human beings. And this idea that we should be thinking about nature in that context, as well as the context of nature in the sense of human need, is not something that we as individuals, let alone collectively, I think, talk about, at least in first world countries or in the kind of Western legal sense. But the legal system itself is nowhere near that, even with successes happening domestically and internationally around moving really a bundle of rights forward, which also gets into the realm, legally speaking, of, does it even make sense to say that people should be the guardian of nature? We have means of which in our own legal system that you can be, a legal guardian for a minor, for instance, or someone who's not capable of making decisions. So you step into their shoes to make legal decisions for them. But is nature really incapacitated? Is nature unable to make its own decisions? These are big questions on how the legal system needs to be formulated to function in a way that needs to, in the sense of protecting nature for our own existence, really, but also to recognize nature for what nature is. And I often wonder if we even really have language for that. And if we don't have language for that, how does that get articulated through law? So I think we're in a very early stage of figuring that out. But the fact that people are moving into those realms and doing it in opposition to what really the existing system continues to subscribe to is absolutely 100% necessary. That there is no time to sort of get it all figured out. I think we know enough already within the constructs of how these laws can be constructed to start putting them in place. But there may be some other things that have to continue to be figured out over time. So I fully support all these things really moving forward, but also challenge those maybe doing it in, let's say, a more narrow capacity to think, to stop and think more broadly about what does it really mean, and are we really doing it in the full, most robust kind of way that nature deserves?
Oh, I love the way you put that. Yes, I agree with you. And I think that we need to get better as a species, as human species, the human species at going back to that ability to be able to listen to nature, which I think we probably, certainly in the Western world, we've lost. And I talked about that quite a bit on another podcast episode with Derek Jensen about this idea of listening to nature and what that means. And it feels like we need to reconnect with that ability a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And I had my perspective changed on that very question a few years ago. I'd come across a woman named Vicki McCabe who had passed away as she was working on or was close to finishing a book that she was writing about the Juwasi people in the Kalahari, and talking about how they managed to stay together as an intact, healthy, robust community society for so long. And it all came with just connection to place. And that connection to place, though I'm sure individually, maybe collectively, had some, let's say, sort of spiritual element for them, it was largely about practicality, that, you screw up the place that keeps you alive, you're screwing yourself up. So had me really thinking about rights of nature in that sort of manner, that this is really about, and really bare bones, stripped down thinking. It's about being smart and practical about your place, and not just for us that are living now, but for those that are going to come, and sort of instilling cultural and behavioral practices that really much are connected to place, because we've become so wildly disconnected, that we're suffering what we're suffering, and other species are suffering what they're suffering because of that.
Yeah. And an ironic twist, the thing that allows us to become disconnected to place, the ability to fly all over the world or move 10 times in your life or whatever, is the very thing that's causing all the problems that we're trying to deal with.
Yeah. Yep. It becomes very complex and multi-layered, which is also an unfortunate component of our current reality. that, because of the massiveness of what it is, it can freeze people. But I think what is exciting is people moving forward in the rights of nature way and the community rights way. They understand that as well, but it hasn't stopped them from acting and beginning to try to shift that dynamic for the sake of people, community, nature today and in the future.
Yeah. Well, speaking of community rights, which you just mentioned, you have been involved with cases that use an approach to protecting the environment based on community rights. I'm thinking specifically of Lincoln County, Oregon, where you have worked, where they passed an aerial spray ban in 2017 that went beyond just banning chemical spraying. It asserts the right of the local community to self-govern and specifically calls out corporations in its statements of law, saying that it's unlawful for corporations to violate the ordinance against aerial spraying, which is actually a really big deal. So can you talk about why and what community rights is and how it kind of fits into this picture?
Yeah, it fits in the picture in the sense that there's this anchor component about rights and the rights of people in the community, and we've been talking largely about rights of nature. But this idea of the question of if government is going to be legitimate, shouldn't government be doing what it should be doing in the sense of protecting the health, safety, and welfare of people in that sort of rights context? And that our system of government, unfortunately, has been designed such that it allows for this hierarchical, centralized decision-making process, which has been utilized in the last 100 or so years by corporate interests to override really the rights of people. So in some ways to really override the rights of the purpose of government itself. And those who feel the brunt of that are people at the community level, that they've been deliberately written out of any decision-making power based on how that system of government works, based on how our system of law works. And people have come to this recognition that they see that as illegitimate, that doesn't even fit within the context of, the Declaration of Independence or aspects really of the Constitution itself, or even fundamentally what the idea of government is or who holds political power, even outside those specific documents, or even the Constitution of Oregon talking about the political power being inherent in the people. That what do those things mean if they don't have any functional reality about them, that they're ignored and trampled on and dismissed, especially when it comes to the health of the people because of the actions of toxic spraying of pesticides by helicopter on the forests that then enter the watersheds that then work their way into the ocean, and having reams and reams and reams and reams of evidence out there that this stuff is not only dangerous but deadly, and yet the government continues to sanction the use of it and legalize it, and the people have been disempowered to do anything about it. That people are saying, well, that's illegitimate, and we're going to legitimately put an end to it and assert our right to say, in this case, no to that practice, and ban it through our own local lawmaking capabilities. That we have this right of self-government. That's not only a constitutional right, but it's an inherent right as people, especially when people come collectively to make decisions about their own well-being, that they have that power to do that, and they're not being kowtowed by these major legal powers or corporate interests and corporate money and political power to say that, you don't matter. They're standing up and saying, hell yes, we matter, and we're going to assert that. And also in that process, recognizing the rights of their ecosystems to not be exposed to those very same things that they don't want to be exposed to as people. It's a pretty significant act. People would say, quite radical. At the same time, it's really fundamentally a responsibility that government has failed, and it's about pointing that out and course correcting for that, which is a basic duty, I think, of being a citizen of anywhere. That if your system of rules aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing in the sense of protecting health, safety, and welfare, well, they're meaningless at that point. And if you have to actually take on the very system itself to change that, well, unfortunately, that's what you need to do. And again, kudos to the people in Lincoln County, Oregon, for taking that action and understanding, that there are going to be consequences, because the system itself doesn't really care about the damage to people and nature. It has been not only convinced but controlled by those who continue to see the world in a very mechanistic, lifeless kind of way. And these people are working to change that, because that is not life, despite what the people who sell the chemicals and people who use the chemicals want others to believe. And believe me, they understand that this is about a shift of power. So in real simple terms, it's about the power of the people where you're at to make decisions about your own welfare. And those who've been making the decisions, who currently make all those decisions, understand this is about taking that power back that rightfully belongs to those people in Lincoln County. And they're going to do anything and everything they can to make sure that that doesn't happen, not only there, but really anywhere.
I was reading the Grant Township Home Rule Charter, which they modified a couple of years ago, I think, to state that they possess the right of self-government and that they possess the right to clean air, water, and soil. And I found very interesting that they explicitly stated in that charter that corporations that violate the laws of the charter shall not be deemed to be persons if it interferes with the rights of the charter, which I felt like they were very explicitly saying, hey, we're grabbing back some of that power.
Yeah, it's well, I mean, I know that because I've been involved with it for so long. I know some of the people from that community. I know the story on a pretty rich, deep basis. But just having you say that just now, it's quite amazing.
It is.
And powerful. Again, at the same time, it's so sensible, and also should be so absolutely maddening that that's not how it is now, in the sense of, why isn't that recognized? Why are they having to fight so hard to protect the place that they love? And why is the system looking at them as somehow wrongdoers, that they should be punished, when it's the system itself that's doing the wrong here, doing the harm? So yeah, it's that kind of standing up for injustice. I mean, it's what we've seen in our own history, and as well as in other places around the globe, that there's a breaking point where people understand that the authorization of what's happening, that it can be legal, it doesn't make it legitimate or ethical or moral, but it can be legal. And when that happens, well, you have to make a decision about what you're going to do about it. And those people in Grant Township, as people did, in the civil rights era, or the era of the suffragists or the revolutionaries, when the British Empire was controlling everything, finally had enough, and pushed back. And they didn't just push back, but they pushed for a different alternative, a different value system. A value system of how government should work and what it should be about, which in the case of what's happening now in Grant Township or in Lincoln County or San Juan County or wherever, this idea that nature needs to be legally protected with a set of rights. And so that's also part of the pushback that is happening. And hopefully it continues to grow, and there's real energy out there. And I think real momentum can be built if more people understand in more communities that this is the situation we're in, that this is the structure. And if they're not satisfied, well, it's really up to them to begin to change that and to follow through. I think it's possible. I don't know how probable, but I think it's very possible.
I sure hope so. I know there are some people that associate community rights with the ability to pass regressive laws that promote inequality, like Jim Crow laws. And I know that you and CELDF more broadly, when you advise communities on community rights and rights of nature, that you try to build in language that prevents that kind of abuse of community rights. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that? Because I know that has been a concern for some people.
Yeah, I think the easiest way, which may not be easy in the sense of people's understanding of how the relationships work through the different levels of government, but as a way to get an understanding of what's being talked about here. Our system of law works today such that the federal government in certain realms has set the floor on rights protections, but the courts have said that it's okay if the states want to raise that standard of protection. So want to have greater rights. So, for instance, around rights of workers in the workplace, Washington State has a more expansive rights protection for workers than the federal law. So, what we're saying here really is that what hasn't happened is that recognition that the local level could advance rights protections greater than the state, that it hasn't gone far enough. It's sort of stopped at that sort of state-federal relationship, but that it needs to make its way down to the community level, because what we're seeing today really is actions being taken by the state or the federal that are really undermining rights, and the local is left with no protection for that. And so these laws are really about expanding rights protections. I think the other reality of what's happening here that often gets lost, because people kind of fall into, well, if you let communities decide, won't they discriminate or segregate in the way that had transpired, in the South. I think we often don't also understand that period of history is that the federal government really failed those communities, yet the federal government is seen as somehow the savior or the giver of rights when it comes to civil rights today. But I don't think we really fully understand that period of history as it unfolded well enough to understand what was really going on. With that sort of slight aside now, the other true reality going on here of what's been happening is we see a system today of which certain interests, largely corporate interests, they control all the buttons and levers. And so they're running things at will, and they're basically controlling, containing, you can even go far as to say enslaving communities. That's not just the people, but the nature within that community, with really no recognizability for that community to do anything about it. And that these laws really are about limiting that overreach, that really illegitimate overreach of power that corporations are using, and using really federal government and local and the state government really as shields for that. And that these laws really are about addressing that. So I think there's the question of where does this all go if self-government really is recognized in the way that's been talked about through community rights? How could it be, quote unquote, abused? And I think that the best examples out there are to look at the various state constitutional amendments in that realm that are being circulated now. So whether it's in New Hampshire or Ohio or Pennsylvania or Oregon, there's really explicit language that talks about that local governments have the ability to expand rights, but not the ability to reduce rights or protections. So that's another means of which, at that level at least, the laws are looking to say, well, there's a limiter here. This is, again, if government is about protecting rights, we don't want to have the ability of government at any level to somehow violate or deny that or abuse that. So the same needs to go for the local level. So I think, again, there's the question of what does it look like, and then there's the reality of why it's coming about, and then there's, again, the third arena of state constitutional amendments at this point that speak directly to that question itself.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, it really feels to me that as the environmental impacts of industrial civilization worsen dramatically, and climate change worsens, and biodiversity crisis worsens, that people are beginning to feel the direct effects of our impact on the natural world. So it feels like this is a crucial moment for us to have things like community rights and rights of nature in hand, ready to go, so that people can take back some of the power and do what they need to be able to do to protect their communities and their environment. And so I love that like the Lake Erie Bill of Rights and the Grand Township Charter, they're getting talked about more. And so it feels like more people are starting to see the value of these approaches. They're seeing how current environmental laws are failing us. Clearly, there are still plenty of people who think that everything's fine. But on the whole, it feels like awareness of the situation's growing, and that the movement that we're trying to build has potential to grow. I'm curious what you see as sort of the next big successes in the rights of nature movement, where they might happen, how they might happen, what that could potentially lead to.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on where we sit today, and the um, the possibility of all that emerging, and then feeding into building out the probability because of that, in the sense that, okay, people are doing it, and this is what it looks like, and maybe it's not so scary, and maybe it is where we should be going, and perhaps these are the values that we need to be reflecting. And if laws is about rules that are supposed to reflect a certain value system, and the value system now says it's okay to destroy the natural world, and with no more need for the next dire report climactically to come out to have to remind us, it should be said, we should be saying, okay, well, perhaps we need the opposite system then. And that rights of nature is a strong reflection of that different value system. I think as to where it's going to go, I still think largely it's going to emerge from communities at this point. I'm not too sure how much is really going to come from higher levels. There are attempts either through litigation or through legislation in different places. So I think it's really going to come from community members deciding that they too need to move this new paradigm forward, and have that be hopefully that kind of political force that changes things at the next levels. I think there's also some ripeness that seems to be happening in indigenous communities here in North America. There are a number of Native American communities, governments really, who have also worked in this realm of asserting, expressed rights for nature. I think that's not only very exciting, but also very necessary and energizing for the greater collective if more of that begins to emerge. And I think there is some real potential there. I think that's that collective force of that happening, along with other communities doing the same, is a very not only powerful statement, but again, the momentum or movement building type energy that's needed. And I think a real critical realm of which can help even accelerate this more is also what Lake Erie started, which is this idea of water, and our view of water, and perhaps that has to also change as Lake Erie is proposing. And so we have places now like in Lane County, Oregon, who are looking at rights of water and watershed protection laws that really look at how do we protect water for the sake of humans' connections to it, but also other species, the ecosystem itself. And I think that's not only necessary, but also a very powerful way to bring that message out there, and maybe build that movement again on that particular topic. So yeah, I don't want to say hopeful, but definitely feeling energized about what's going and what could be going, and that we maybe have broken through to a different dimension now in a way. I think Lake Erie fed off everything that came before it, but helped sort of push things into a new realm that I don't think we're going to move back from. I think we've evolved. It's a matter now of trying to move that evolution further out and hopefully faster based on where we sit, globally as far as the climate and such.
Mm-hmm. Well, what you said about the rights of nature movement, at least in this country, coming sort of from the bottom up, from communities, small communities filtering up from there, and thinking about that in comparison to, say, Ecuador, that's had their rights of nature language in their constitution now for 10 years or so, which was very much of a top-down thing, obviously driven by people who wanted it there, who came from communities. But it'll be interesting to see how those two kind of approaches differ and in how they get filtered into the broader language in the judiciary, as well as into communities and states and so on.
Yeah, no, I think that's extremely good conversation to keep having, either with oneself or with others. What I think often gets lost, because you and I, as well as the work just sort of has that be the case, is that there's so much talk about, law and governance and sort of the kind of the dry mechanistic sort of elements to all that. But the truth is, this is, and then we've touched upon it, this is about values, this is about behavior, this is about culture. And if we think about, even in historically, when it's come to, the abolition of slavery, and just even the question of race itself, obviously so much driven by that era, and where we sit today, 150 some years later, and what we're still working through, then yeah, I mean, there's these these big elements of generational behavior that, are not only being questioned, but attempted to being forced in a very different direction than we have been acting within. And yeah, that's in Ecuador, as you mentioned, 10 some years hence, still figuring that out. That's the unfortunate. I mean, I think that's the recognition of how these things move, which is not fast. But the fortunate part of that is we need speed based on the rapidly changing climate by our own behavior. So, we don't have the luxury, at least how I see it, as other people's movements have, in the sense of figuring out sort of the cultural rebalancing point that the change has put forward. So this idea of if we recognize from a legal perspective and a governing perspective this idea of rights of nature, and that has to move into behaviorally what we end up deciding to do, both individually but also collectively, let's say through commercial enterprise that has a different framework to work within. That takes quite some time to get used to, functionally speaking. But it's time itself that really is, I think, the big giant question mark for me, if we're going to get there. But I think the optimistic viewpoint is to say, well, if we recognize where we're at is not where we want to be, and we have an idea where we want to go, well, then naturally we need to become advocates for that. And we need to attempt to get there, even if the chances of getting there aren't great. It's, again, an obligation that I feel, at least individually, but also in the work that I've been doing. Again, not just for now, but ideally for people to come and the species to come.
Yeah. Well, keep hoping that it'll speed up and we'll hit some tipping point, and then it'll be obvious that this was the right thing to do all along.
Just like that.
Just like that, yeah. Well, thank you, Kai, for your time today and for your wonderful conversation about rights of nature, and really appreciate it. And good luck with everything.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for providing the space. It's so necessary, and having a venue like this for us just to talk, and hopefully for others to listen in and I guess carry on the conversation that we've been having here, and more importantly, really chewing on how do we move this into action, so it's not just conversation or analysis or debate, but that real action's happening, because we're in dire need of that.
Yes, we are. Thank you very much.